The morning Richard Harrington died, the sky was gray and heavy with rain. His wife Elena found him in their bedroom, still and peaceful, as if he had simply decided not to wake up. She sat beside him for nearly an hour before calling anyone. She held his cold hand and whispered things that nobody else would ever hear. By the time the ambulance arrived, her tears had dried, and her face had turned into something hard and distant. People would later mistake that look for coldness. They would call it suspicious. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Elena had been preparing for this moment for 6 months. She had cried all her tears in secret, late at night, while Richard slept. Now that he was gone, she had nothing left. Richard Harrington was 68 years old when he passed. He had built his fortune from nothing, starting with a single rental property in his 20s and growing it into one of the largest real estate empires in the country. His face had appeared on magazine covers. His name was attached to buildings, shopping centers, and luxury hotels across 3 continents. People called him a genius. They called him ruthless. They called him lucky. But to Elena, he was just Richard, a man who loved black coffee and old jazz records, a man who laughed too loud at his own jokes and cried during sad movies when he thought nobody was watching. They had met 7 years ago at a charity gala. Elena was 29 at the time, a concert pianist who had been hired to perform for the evening. She remembered the way Richard had watched her play, completely still among the crowd of chattering guests. After her performance, he approached her with a glass of champagne and a nervous smile that seemed out of place on a man worth billions. "I don't know anything about classical music," he admitted, "but that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." She laughed. Most wealthy men at these events tried to impress her with their knowledge, whether real or invented. Richard's honesty was refreshing. They talked for 3 hours that night. He told her about growing up poor, about the father who abandoned his family, about the mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. She told him about her childhood in a small town, about the old piano teacher who recognized her talent and gave her lessons for free, about the years of struggle before her career finally took off. By the end of the night, Elena realized she had forgotten he was a billionaire. He was just a man with kind eyes and a warm laugh, and she wanted to see him again. They married 2 years later. It was a small ceremony, just close friends and immediate family. Richard's children did not attend. Vincent Harrington was 42, the older of Richard's 2 children from his first marriage. He had his father's sharp jaw and dark eyes, but none of his warmth. Vincent had spent his entire adult life in his father's shadow, working for the family company but never quite measuring up. He resented Richard for setting impossible standards. He resented himself for failing to meet them. And when his father remarried a woman younger than Vincent's own wife, that resentment found a new target. "She's a gold digger," Vincent told anyone who would listen. "She saw an old man with money and she moved in for the kill." Clarissa, Richard's daughter, was 39 and shared her brother's suspicions. She had been closer to their mother, Richard's first wife, who had died of cancer 15 years ago. Watching her father move on, watching him laugh and smile with this new woman, felt like a betrayal. It didn't matter that Elena had never asked for expensive gifts or demanded access to family accounts. It didn't matter that she continued working as a pianist, earning her own money, maintaining her own identity. In Clarissa's eyes, Elena would always be an outsider, a threat, a replacement for the mother she still mourned. The funeral was held 4 days after Richard's death. Hundreds of people attended, business partners and politicians, and celebrities who wanted to be seen paying their respects. Elena sat in the front row, dressed in black, her face pale and expressionless. Vincent and Clarissa sat on the opposite side of the aisle, as far from her as possible. The whispers started before the service even ended. "She looks so calm," someone murmured. "Almost like she expected this. She looks so calm. I heard she was the one who found him, alone, no witnesses. Did you know he changed his will last month? Left her almost everything." By the time Elena returned to the mansion that evening, the rumors had spread across social media and news outlets. Reporters gathered outside the gates, shouting questions as her car passed through. "Elena, did you know your husband was going to change his will? Elena, Are you aware the family is contesting the inheritance? Elena. Do you have any comment on the accusations? She said nothing. She walked inside, closed the door, and stood alone in the hallway of a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Vincent hired a private investigator named Douglas Brennan, a former police detective with a reputation for digging up secrets. Clarissa gave interviews to anyone who would listen, painting Elena as a manipulative schemer who had isolated their father from his family. She controlled everything, Clarissa told a reporter, her eyes wet with practiced tears. Who he saw, where he went, what he ate. We barely recognized him anymore. This was not true. Richard had remained close with his business partners, his old friends, his golf buddies. He had lunch with his grandchildren every month and never missed a birthday party. But the truth was boring. The lie was better television. The private investigator's findings made things worse. He discovered that Elena had been secretly meeting with Richard's personal physician for months before his death. He found records of phone calls between Elena and an attorney who specialized in estate planning, someone outside the family's usual legal team. He photographed Elena leaving a medical supply store with bags of equipment. To Vincent and Clarissa, this was proof. Their stepmother had been planning something. She had been hiding something. And now their father was dead, and she stood to inherit the fortune they believed was rightfully theirs. The tabloids gave Elena a nickname that made her sick every time she saw it. They called her the Black Widow Bride. They published old photos from her performing days, analyzing her expressions, her body language, searching for signs of the monster they had already decided she was. Elena stopped leaving the house. She stopped answering her phone. She sat alone in the library where Richard used to read, surrounded by his books, his photographs, his presence. Some nights, she played the grand piano in the corner, the same instrument where she had performed for him so many times. She played until her fingers ached, until the music drowned out the noise of the world outside. She could have defended herself. She could have told the truth and ended the accusations overnight. But she had made a promise to Richard. A promise she intended to keep, no matter how much it cost her. Wait until the will reading, he had told her during one of their final conversations. Let me tell them myself. It's the only way they'll believe it. So Elena waited. She endured the hatred and the suspicion and the loneliness. She watched her reputation crumble. She let the world believe the worst about her, because Richard had asked her to, and she had never once, in 7 years of marriage, broken a promise to the man she loved. Douglas Brennan had been a detective for 23 years before he went private. He had solved cases that made headlines. He had put dangerous people behind bars, and in all those years, he had learned one important lesson. Evidence could be twisted to tell any story you wanted. The trick was deciding which story to tell before you started looking. Vincent Harrington had made it clear what story he wanted. His stepmother was a criminal, a manipulator, a woman who had married a dying old man and sped up his death to collect her inheritance. All Douglas had to do was find the proof. The first piece came easily. Phone records showed that Elena had been in regular contact with Richard's personal physician, Dr. Franklin Webb, for nearly 6 months before Richard died. The calls were frequent, sometimes lasting an hour or more. Elena had also visited the doctor's office multiple times, always alone, always without telling anyone in the family. Why would she need to talk to his doctor so much? Vincent demanded when Douglas presented the findings. Unless she was planning something. The second piece was even more damaging. Elena had made dozens of calls to an attorney named Robert Chen, a specialist in estate planning who had no previous connection to the Harrington family. Their regular lawyers knew nothing about these conversations. Whatever Elena and this attorney had discussed, she had kept it completely secret. She was rewriting the will behind everyone's back, Clarissa said, her voice shaking with anger. She manipulated our father into giving her everything. Douglas continued digging. He interviewed household staff, delivery drivers, anyone who had regular access to the mansion. Most of them had nothing useful to say. Elena was quiet, polite, kept to herself. But one housekeeper, A woman named Patricia, who had worked for the family for 15 years, offered something interesting. She was always ordering medical supplies, Patricia said. Boxes and boxes of them. I asked her once what they were for, and she just smiled and said it was nothing to worry about. When Douglas checked the records, he found receipts for oxygen equipment, hospital-grade pain medication, and specialized bedding designed for patients with limited mobility. The orders had started 8 months ago and continued right up until Richard's death. To Vincent and Clarissa, the picture was becoming clear. Their stepmother had been preparing for something. She had been gathering supplies, consulting with doctors and lawyers, making arrangements that nobody else knew about. And now their father was dead. They scheduled a family meeting at Vincent's house to discuss their next steps. Extended relatives were invited. Business associates who had been close to Richard, even a few journalists who had proven sympathetic to the family's cause. The goal was simple: build public pressure, destroy Elena's reputation, force her to give up her claim to the inheritance. What none of them knew was the truth behind every piece of evidence they had gathered. 6 months before his death, Richard Harrington received news that changed everything. He had been feeling tired lately, more tired than usual. He had lost weight without trying. There was a pain in his stomach that wouldn't go away. Elena had begged him to see a doctor, and finally, reluctantly, he agreed. The diagnosis was pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Inoperable. Dr. Webb delivered the news in his office, while Elena sat beside her husband. Holding his hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, the doctor explained that treatment could extend Richard's life by a few months, maybe a year if they were lucky, but there was no cure. The cancer had spread too far. Richard sat in silence for a long time after the doctor finished speaking. Then he turned to Elena and said something she would never forget. "I don't want them to know." He meant his children, his business partners, the world. Richard Harrington had spent his entire life being strong. He had built an empire through sheer force of will. The idea of spending his final months being pitied, being treated like a fragile thing waiting to break, was unbearable to him. "If Vincent and Clarissa find out, they'll start fighting over the inheritance before I'm even gone," he said. "I've seen it happen to other families. The vultures circle. Everyone starts calculating what they're going to get. I won't let my last days be about money." Elena wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that his children deserved to know, that keeping this secret was unfair to everyone. But she saw the fear in his eyes. Not fear of death. Fear of losing control. Fear of watching his family tear itself apart while he was still alive to witness it. So she agreed. She promised to keep his illness a secret until after he was gone. The phone calls to Dr. Webb were about managing Richard's symptoms. Elena learned everything she could about pain management, about nutrition, about keeping a dying man comfortable without making him feel like an invalid. She ordered medical supplies and hid them in a private room that only she and Richard entered. She became his nurse, his caretaker, his protector. The calls to Robert Chen, the estate attorney, were Richard's idea. He wanted to make changes to his will, but he didn't trust the family lawyers to keep it confidential. He knew that Vincent had connections at the firm. He knew that word would get back to his children before the ink was dry, so he hired someone new. Someone with no ties to the Harrington family. And he asked Elena to handle the communications because he was too weak to spend hours on the phone discussing legal details. The changes to the will were not what anyone expected. Richard didn't leave everything to Elena. He didn't cut his children out entirely. Instead, he created something more complicated, more thoughtful. He established charitable foundations in his mother's name. He set up trust funds for his grandchildren, with conditions designed to teach them the value of hard work. He left instructions for scholarships, donations, and grants that would continue long after he was gone. Elena received a generous inheritance, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But the bulk of Richard's fortune went to causes he believed in, causes that had nothing to do with his children's greed or his wife's supposed scheming. Richard also did something else, something that would only be revealed at the will reading. He recorded a message, a video that explained everything. His diagnosis, his reasons for keeping it secret, his feelings about each member of his family. He arranged for this video to be triggered in a special way, a way that only Elena knew about, a way that would force everyone to sit and listen without interruption. "They won't believe you if you try to explain," Richard told her near the end. "They've already made up their minds. The only person they'll believe is me." Elena watched her husband grow weaker day by day. She watched him struggle to walk, to eat, to breathe. She held him during the nights when the pain became too much. She whispered that she loved him, until those words were the only thing she could offer. And through it all, she kept her promise. She said nothing. When Richard finally passed, peacefully in his sleep just as he had wanted, Elena felt something break inside her. Not just grief. Something deeper. The weight of carrying a secret that had consumed her life for half a year. She knew what was coming. The accusations, the investigations, the hatred. She knew that Vincent and Clarissa would blame her, that the world would believe the worst. She could have ended it with a single statement. She could have revealed the cancer diagnosis and watched the accusations crumble overnight. But she had promised Richard. Wait until the will reading. Let him tell them himself. So Elena endured. She let Douglas Brennan dig through her life. She let Clarissa paint her as a monster on television. She let the tabloids call her names that made her sick. She did it all because Richard had asked her to, and because she knew that in the end, the truth would come out. She just had to survive long enough to see it. The day of the will reading arrived on a Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Richard Harrington was buried. The sky was clear and bright, almost offensive in its cheerfulness. Elena stood at her bedroom window and watched the cars begin to arrive. Black sedans and luxury SUVs lined the long driveway, carrying people who had come to witness what they expected to be her downfall. She had barely slept the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard's face. She heard his voice telling her to be strong, to trust him, to wait just a little longer. But waiting had become almost impossible. The weight of the secret pressed down on her chest like a stone. Some mornings she woke up and forgot, just for a moment, that he was gone. Then the memory would crash back, and she would have to learn how to breathe all over again. Elena dressed carefully that morning. A simple black dress. No jewelry except her wedding ring. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She had lost weight. There were shadows under her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. She looked like someone who had been through a war. In a way, she had. The will reading was scheduled for 11 o'clock in the grand library of the mansion. This had been Richard's favorite room. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, filled with first editions and rare volumes he had collected over decades. A massive stone fireplace dominated one end of the room. And in the corner, near the tall windows that overlooked the garden, sat the grand piano. A Steinway, over 100 years old, with keys that had turned slightly yellow with age. Richard had bought it for Elena as a wedding gift. She had played it for him hundreds of times, filling this room with music while he sat in his leather chair and listened with his eyes closed. Now that chair sat empty, and the room was filling with people who wanted to see her destroyed. Vincent arrived first, accompanied by his wife and 2 lawyers. He wore an expensive suit and the expression of barely contained satisfaction. He nodded at Elena when he entered, but said nothing. His eyes swept over her like she was already gone, like she was a problem that would soon be solved. Clarissa came next, followed by her husband and a small group of relatives. She had been crying. Or, at least, she wanted people to think she had. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she clutched a tissue in her hand like a prop. When she saw Elena, her expression hardened into something cold and hateful. "I hope you're ready," Clarissa said quietly as she passed. "This ends today." More people arrived. Business partners who had worked with Richard for decades. Board members from his various companies. Old friends who had known him since his early days. And scattered among them, a few faces Elena didn't recognize. People who had no real connection to Richard but had somehow secured an invitation anyway. She suspected Vincent had arranged for them to be there, witnesses to her humiliation. By 11 o'clock, nearly 40 people had gathered in the library. They sat in rows of chairs that had been arranged, facing a small podium where the family attorney, Mr. Harold Whitmore, would read the will. Elena sat alone in the front row, separated from the rest of the family by an empty chair that nobody wanted to fill. Mr. Whitmore was a thin man in his 60s with gray hair and a serious face. He had been Richard's attorney for over 30 years, one of the few people who knew the full contents of the will. He cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Before we proceed with the reading of Mr. Harrington's last will and testament, I must inform you of a specific condition that Mr. Harrington included in his final instructions." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Vincent leaned forward in his seat, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of condition?" he demanded. Mr. Whitmore glanced at Elena, then back at the crowd. "Mr. Harrington requested that before the will is read, his wife Elena perform a piece on the piano." The reaction was immediate. Scoffs and whispers filled the room. Someone in the back actually laughed out loud. "You can't be serious," Vincent said, rising from his chair. "We're here to discuss legal matters. We're here to address the obvious irregularities in my father's final decisions. We are not here to sit through a concert." "I understand your frustration, Mr. Whitmore replied calmly. However, these were Mr. Harrington's explicit wishes. The will cannot be read until this condition is fulfilled. This is non-negotiable. If you have a face. Thanks for watching. I won of this quide. These were Mr. Harrington's explicit wishes. Clarissa stood up beside her brother. "This is ridiculous. She's stalling. She knows what's coming and she's trying to delay it. I assure you, this request came directly from your father," Mr. Whitmore said. "It was written into his instructions months ago. If you choose not to comply, the reading will be postponed indefinitely." The room erupted into angry whispers. Vincent's lawyers huddled together, debating whether they could challenge the condition legally. Clarissa glared at Elena with pure hatred, convinced this was some kind of trick. Through it all, Elena sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face revealed nothing. Inside, her heart was pounding so hard, she could feel it in her throat. This was the moment Richard had planned for. This was why he had made her promise to wait. "Fine," Vincent finally spat. "Let her play her little song. But this doesn't change anything. When she's done, we're going to expose every lie she's told." Mr. Whitmore nodded and turned to Elena. "Mrs. Harrington, whenever you're ready." Elena rose slowly from her chair. She could feel every eye in the room following her as she walked toward the piano. The distance seemed impossibly long, like walking through water. Her legs felt weak, her hands were trembling. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, running her fingers along the smooth black wood. She remembered the day Richard had surprised her with it. She remembered his face when she played for him the first time, the tears in his eyes, the way he had held her afterward and told her it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. She sat down on the bench and positioned her hands over the keys. The room had gone completely silent. Even the people who hated her couldn't look away. Elena took a deep breath. She thought of Richard. She thought of his voice, his laugh, his hands holding hers in the final days. She thought of the promise she had kept through weeks of accusations and hatred and loneliness. "This is for you," she whispered, so quietly that no one else could hear. Then she began to play. The first notes filled the room like light breaking through clouds. It was Chopin, the same piece she had performed the night she and Richard first met. The melody was soft and haunting, filled with longing and loss. Elena closed her eyes and let the music carry her away from the hostile faces and the whispered accusations. For a few moments, she was back in that ballroom 7 years ago, playing for a stranger who would become the love of her life. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some of them had expected something short, a token gesture to satisfy the strange condition in the will. But Elena played on, and the music began to change. Halfway through the piece, the melody shifted into something unfamiliar, something nobody in the room had ever heard before. The notes were different, arranged in a pattern that seemed almost like a code. Vincent frowned. Clarissa exchanged a confused glance with her husband. And then, from hidden speakers built into the walls of the library, a voice filled the room. Richard's voice. "My dear family," he said. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone. And I imagine you've spent the past few weeks making Elena's life absolutely miserable." Elena kept playing, tears streaming down her face, as her husband's voice rose from beyond the grave to tell the truth at last. The room froze. Every person, every breath, every heartbeat seemed to stop at once. Richard Harrington's voice filled the library like he was standing right there among them, alive and strong, and impossible to ignore. Elena's fingers continued moving across the piano keys, playing softly now, a gentle backdrop to the words her husband had recorded months before his death. Tears fell from her eyes onto the ivory keys. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. This was what Richard had asked of her. This was why she had endured everything. "I know what you're thinking," Richard's voice continued. "You're thinking this is some kind of trick. Some manipulation by the woman you've spent weeks trying to destroy. But I promise you, every word you're about to hear comes from me and me alone." Elena didn't know what I was going to say. She only knew that I asked her to play this piano one last time, and that the truth would finally come out. Vincent stood frozen in the middle of the room, his face pale. Clarissa had sunk back into her chair, her hand pressed against her mouth. The lawyers, the business partners, the relatives and friends who had gathered to witness Elena's downfall sat in stunned silence. 6 months before I died, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 4, terminal. The doctors gave me less than a year to live, and they were right. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," under their breath. Vincent shook his head slowly, like he was trying to wake up from a dream. "I made a decision that day," Richard continued. "I decided not to tell anyone except Elena and my doctor. I know some of you will think that was selfish. Maybe it was. But I had my reasons." The recording paused for a moment. When Richard spoke again, his voice was heavier, tinged with sadness. "I've watched families destroy themselves over money. I've seen brothers stop speaking to each other. I've seen children sue their parents. I've seen love turn to hatred the moment someone mentions an inheritance. I didn't want that for us. I didn't want my final months to be filled with lawyers and arguments and people calculating what they were going to get when I was gone." Elena's playing grew softer, almost disappearing beneath Richard's words. "So I kept my illness a secret. And I asked Elena to keep it secret too. I asked her to carry this burden alone, to watch me grow weaker day by day, to hold my hand through the pain and the fear and the sleepless nights. I asked her to do all of this while knowing that when I died, she would be blamed for everything." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "And she did it. She did it without complaint. She did it because I asked her to. She did it because she loved me." Clarissa began to cry. Real tears this time. Not the practiced performance she had given for the cameras. Her husband put his arm around her, but she pushed him away. "Now let me tell you what Elena actually did during those 6 months," Richard said. "The phone calls to my doctor that you found so suspicious? She was learning how to manage my symptoms, how to help me eat when I couldn't keep food down, how to adjust my medication when the pain became unbearable. She became my nurse, my caretaker, my guardian. She did things for me that no wife should ever have to do. And she did them with grace and love and patience." The room was completely silent now. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The calls to the attorney? That was my idea. I wanted to change my will, but I knew that if I used the family lawyers, word would get back to Vincent within days. He has friends at the firm. Don't look so surprised. Son, I've always known about your connections, so I hired someone new, someone with no ties to any of you, and I asked Elena to handle the communications because I was too weak to do it myself. Vincent's face had turned from pale to red. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse around him. The medical supplies, the equipment that housekeeper told the investigator about, oxygen tanks, and pain medication, and special bedding. Elena ordered all of it to keep me comfortable. She turned one of the guest rooms into a private medical suite, where I could rest without anyone knowing how sick I really was. She did this because I asked her to, because I was too proud to let anyone see me that way. Richard's voice grew stronger now, harder. And while Elena was doing all of this, while she was sacrificing her sleep, and her health, and her peace of mind, to care for a dying man, what were my children doing? Let me tell you exactly what I know. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Vincent took a step backward, bumping into an empty chair. Vincent, you hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on my wife before my body was even cold. You contacted 3 different tabloid reporters to feed them stories about Elena. You tried to bribe 2 members of my household staff to give false testimony about her behavior. Yes, I know about all of it. I had people watching you too. Vincent's lawyers exchanged panicked glances. One of them began gathering his papers, as if preparing to leave. Clarissa, you gave 14 interviews in the 3 weeks after my death. In those interviews, you called Elena a gold digger, a manipulator, a predator. You said she isolated me from my family, which is a lie. You said she controlled my finances, which is also a lie. You said she was responsible for my death, which is not only a lie but a cruel and vicious accusation against a woman whose only crime was loving your father. Clarissa sobbed openly now, her face buried in her hands. I want everyone in this room to understand something, Richard said, his voice rising. Elena never asked me for money. She never asked to be put in my will. When I told her I was changing my estate plans, she actually argued against it. She said she didn't need anything, that she just wanted to spend whatever time we had left together. I had to convince her to accept what I was leaving her. Elena's hands finally stilled on the piano keys. The music faded, and only Richard's voice remained. I am not a fool. I built a fortune from nothing. I've negotiated with some of the smartest and most ruthless people in the world. Do you really think I couldn't recognize a con artist? Do you really think I would be fooled by a woman who only wanted my money? The question hung in the air, unanswered. I fell in love with Elena because she was kind and talented and genuine. She made me laugh. She made me think. She made the last 7 years of my life happier than I ever thought possible. And when I was dying, she held me together. She gave me dignity. She let me face the end on my own terms. Richard's voice softened again, becoming almost gentle. I'm not asking you to love her. I'm not asking you to accept her as family. I'm only asking you to see the truth. Elena is not a villain. She is not a criminal. She is a woman who loved your father and honored his wishes, even when those wishes cost her everything. The recording paused again. When Richard spoke next, there was a finality in his tone that made everyone lean forward. Now Mr. Whitmore is going to read my will. You will find that I have been fair to all of you. Perhaps more fair than some of you deserve. But I want you to sit there and listen, while understanding one thing. Every cruel word you spoke about Elena, every lie you told, every scheme you planned against her, I know about it. I knew about it before I died. And I chose to give you one more chance anyway. Another pause. Don't waste it. The speakers went silent. Richard's voice was gone, replaced by a stillness so heavy it felt almost physical. Elena sat at the piano with her head bowed, tears falling silently into her lap. She had kept her promise. She had waited. And now, finally, the truth was out. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat softly. He looked around the room at the shocked faces, the guilty expressions, the tears, and the shame. Shall I proceed with the reading of the will? He asked. Nobody answered. Nobody could speak. Elena finally raised her head and looked at the family that had tried so hard to destroy her. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel victorious. She only felt tired. Tired, and sad, and empty. But somewhere, deep beneath the grief, she also felt free. Richard had kept his promise too. He had told them the truth himself. And now, whatever came next, she would face it with her head held high. The silence in the library lasted for what felt like hours. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak. Nobody wanted to acknowledge what had just happened. The weight of Richard's words hung over them all like a storm cloud that refused to pass. Mr. Whitmore finally opened the folder containing the will. His hands were steady, but his voice was softer than before, as if he too had been affected by what he had witnessed. "I will now read the last will and testament of Richard Allen Harrington," he began. Vincent remained standing in the middle of the room, unable to move. His face had gone through a dozen expressions in the past few minutes. Shock, denial, anger, shame. Now it had settled into something blank and hollow. Clarissa was still crying quietly, mascara streaking down her cheeks, the tissue in her hand torn to shreds. The will was not what anyone expected. Elena received the family mansion and a sum of money that would allow her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. It was generous, but it was nowhere near the billions that Vincent and Clarissa had assumed she would inherit. Their accusations of gold digging suddenly looked even more foolish than before. The bulk of Richard's fortune went to charity. He had established 3 separate foundations in the months before his death. One provided scholarships for students from low-income families, named after his mother who had worked 2 jobs to keep him in school. Another funded music education programs for underprivileged children, inspired by Elena's own journey as a pianist. The third supported cancer research, a cause that had become deeply personal in his final months. Vincent and Clarissa each received an inheritance. It was substantial by normal standards, enough to ensure they would never struggle financially, but compared to what they had expected, compared to what they believed they were entitled to, it was a fraction. A reminder that their father had seen through their greed and chosen to redirect his wealth toward people who actually needed it. Along with the money, each of them received a handwritten letter from Richard. The letters were sealed, meant to be read in private. Mr. Whitmore handed them over with a solemn expression, and both siblings accepted them with trembling hands. There was one final provision in the will. Richard had created trust funds for each of his grandchildren, but the money could only be accessed under certain conditions. The grandchildren had to complete their education. They had to perform a certain number of community service hours each year. They had to demonstrate what Richard called character and compassion before receiving their full inheritance. It was his way of ensuring that his wealth would build something good in the next generation, rather than simply creating more entitlement. When Mr. Whitmore finished reading, the room slowly began to empty. People left in small groups, whispering among themselves, avoiding eye contact with Elena. Some of them looked ashamed, others looked confused, still processing everything they had heard. A few approached Elena on their way out, offering quiet apologies or awkward words of support. She accepted them gracefully, nodding and thanking them, even though she felt nothing inside. Vincent was one of the last to leave. He stood near the doorway for a long moment, staring at Elena across the room. She met his gaze without flinching. There were no words between them, no apology, no acknowledgement of what he had done. Vincent simply turned and walked out, his shoulders hunched, his expensive suit suddenly looking like it didn't fit quite right. Clarissa lingered even longer. She sat alone in her chair, clutching the sealed letter from her father, tears still falling silently. When the room was nearly empty, she finally stood and approached Elena. "I don't know what to say," Clarissa whispered. Her voice was hoarse from crying. "I don't know how to. I can't." Elena looked at the woman who had called her a murderer on national television. The woman who had dedicated weeks to destroying her reputation. The woman who had refused to believe, even for a moment, that her father might have genuinely loved someone new. "You don't have to say anything right now," Elena replied quietly. "Go home, read your father's letter, take some time to think." Clarissa nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. She opened her mouth as if to say something else, then closed it again. She turned and walked away, leaving Elena alone in the library with only Mr. Whitmore and the ghost of the man they had both loved. The weeks that followed were strange and quiet. The media storm that had consumed Elena's life began to fade as the truth spread. Reporters who had called her a black widow now wrote sympathetic pieces about her sacrifice. The tabloids moved on to new scandals, new villains, new stories to sell. Elena's name slowly disappeared from the headlines. She stayed in the mansion at first. It was the only place where she still felt close to Richard. She would sit in his leather chair in the library and close her eyes, imagining she could hear him breathing beside her. She would play the piano late at night, the same songs she had played for him, letting the music fill the empty spaces where his presence used to be. But eventually, she knew she had to move forward. Richard would not have wanted her to spend the rest of her life trapped in grief. He had given her the resources to do something meaningful, and she intended to honor that gift. Elena threw herself into building the music education foundation that Richard had created in her name. She traveled to schools in underserved communities, meeting children who reminded her of herself at that age, talented kids with no access to instruments or lessons, dreamers who had been told their dreams were too expensive to pursue. She funded programs, hired teachers, donated pianos. She watched young faces light up when they played their first notes. And for the first time since Richard's death, she felt something other than sadness. She also returned to performing. Not for money, not for fame, but for the joy of it. She gave concerts at small venues, community centers, charity events. Every dollar she earned went back into the foundation. Music had saved her once, and now she was determined to let it save others. 2 years after Richard's death, Elena received a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, but the return address made her heart skip. It was from Clarissa. The letter was long and raw and honest. Clarissa wrote about the months of therapy she had undergone, the painful work of examining her own jealousy and grief. She wrote about the letter her father had left her, how his words had broken her open and forced her to see herself clearly for the first time. She wrote about the shame she carried for what she had done to Elena, and the fear that she could never be forgiven. At the end of the letter, Clarissa asked if they could meet, just for tea, just to talk. She didn't expect anything. She just wanted Elena to know that she was sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. Elena read the letter 3 times. Then she picked up her phone and sent a simple reply. "Come over Saturday. I'll make tea." It was not instant forgiveness. It was not a fairy tale ending where everyone became best friends overnight. But it was a beginning. A crack in the wall that had separated them. A chance for something new to grow. Vincent never apologized. He kept his distance, nursing his wounded pride, unable to admit that he had been wrong. But his children, Richard's grandchildren, did not share their father's stubbornness. They began visiting Elena on their own, curious about the woman their grandfather had loved. They called her Aunt Ellie. They asked her to teach them piano. They brought laughter back into the mansion that had been silent for too long. Elena watched these children grow and learn and stumble and rise. She saw pieces of Richard in their smiles, in their curiosity, in their kindness, and she understood, finally, what her husband had known all along. Legacy was not about money. It was not about buildings or business empires or names carved in stone. Legacy was about the people you touched, the lives you changed, the love you left behind. Richard had changed her life. He had loved her completely, trusted her absolutely, and given her the strength to endure the worst moments of her existence. Now, it was her turn to pass that gift forward. She sat down at the piano one evening. The grandchildren gathered around her and began to play. The music filled the room, bright and warm and alive. And somewhere, she knew, Richard was listening. He had always loved to hear her play.